Okay, so now it's episode 6, the Illegitimate Scholar podcast. I'm going to be thinking every single time I start now about how I want a fucking jingle or some shit. All my friends are lazy though, so that's probably not going to happen. I'm going to have to pay somebody to make that. So the reason I say episode 6, I think, is because I don't know how I'm going to do it with doing episodes also with other people. But today I've got my friend Rudy here with me. And we're going to be talking today about culture, about some of the other things that I had. So I don't have as much of a plan for this one as I usually do. Usually I'm rambling and going through a whole list of prompts that I have on a few pages of notes. But now I don't have much. And what I did take, I forgot where it was. And got a total of 4 words on this page here. And one of them is cannibalism. So, okay. So Rudy, you want to mention your background a little bit?
Sure. I am Rudy. I am, so I'm a history student. I am also,
how long have you been a history student?
I've been a history student for a long time.
How many years?
What year is it?
2022.
10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
So you're about to get your PhD?
No, I'm about to get my undergrad. I started my undergrad back in fall of 2012. And I did a few years at University of Toronto, and then ended up taking a few years off and working and doing some other stuff. And I met this guy working at a historical society, and but so now I'm finishing up my degree, one or two credits at a time, doing while I'm also working as a merchant mariner.
Yeah. So you work as a merchant mariner. We met together. We met working at a historical society, a mostly naval historical society. So, I don't know if I've talked too much about it so far, but I do have a big background in naval history and even naval archaeology. So,
so cool.
So I think Rudy and I might talk a little bit about that today, although I'm a little bit more out of practice than he is, and he always knew more than I did. So we're going to talk about a few other things too. Okay, so Rudy, let's start with talking about, I'm going to put you on the spot again. So tell me what we were talking about before and what we wanted to talk about. And that could be as simple as asking me a question to get me talking, but if you want to talk more, go right ahead.
No, that before we started recording, we were talking about that so far as of recording this episode, Sam's posted 4 episodes online, and that I'm only half of a good friend because I've only listened to 2 of them.
It's close enough.
But so we were talking about those 2 episodes, and particularly about, although I do have, there's one really cool, I just wanted to mention, which there was one really cool thing that I really appreciated in your first episode, specifically talking about how getting your driver's license can be a factor of a cultural, so as an example of a cultural practice, which blew my mind, and that for the next 20 minutes I was just driving thinking about that I don't have a background in anthropology, so I just never thought of that in that way, and there's so many cool implications that I got caught up all in.
Exactly. And I think that a driver's license, we should talk about this for a second. Mm-hmm. Like a driver's license, I loved it when you brought this up that you liked this, because I didn't think anything of saying that, because I'm understanding culture as rules is one part of culture. So getting a driver's license is an extension of that, but a driver's license is a very, very specific type of culture, because it requires so many things that are both abstract and non-abstract, and involves a lot of social constructs. So to get a driver's license, I was fortunate enough to be born a citizen of the United States, which comes with it a lot of privileges. So that's really all I needed to do, and prove my address, and I was fortunate enough to have a place to live. So I was able to get my driver's license based on that. But when thinking about a driver's license, think about somebody like there are some people in the world who are stateless in the sense that they do not have a state. So some refugees from certain places, refugees from Palestine, refugees from all other sorts of places, and they might have a state sort of, but it effectively they can be stateless if that state isn't functioning. Like maybe Kurdistan as well, because Kurdistan does not have a recognized state. And, they have states in some senses, but the point of stateless is that they're not recognized. Mm-hmm. There's other people there are these people known as the boat people in Southeast Asia. And they don't have, they live on boats. So they don't have a state because they weren't born on land, and the state people, and these people are very poor, and so they don't have a sort of government or organization. But for somebody from like the boat people who grew up on water to come to the United States, for them to get a driver's license would be impossible. I mean, they could maybe eventually get one, not that they would want to, but if you're somebody, and again, these boat people, they live on boats and they practice traditional practices of fishing. I'm sure they've seen cars because they live around Southeast Asia, but not knowing how to drive a car, not having any sort of state documents on them at all, it would be impossible to emigrate even if you were a citizen of Indonesia. It's a very difficult thing to do if you don't have the resources.
I would also say that, I mean, maybe in that case, I would relate it to, there are boating licenses as you can get, whereas their cultural background, that I'm sure that they don't require boating licenses,
right.
That it's part of their culture and their societal structure, that people just they grow up on boats, they're around them all the time, right. And they don't require a bureaucratic process to be considered to have the authority to use a boat. And while so in the US we don't have formal boating licenses, although if you're below the age of 16 or something, you're supposed to have one. But
right. You don't need a boating license for a kayak.
No, exactly. It's but then in Canada, I know you're specifically, so you do need to take that. It's an online course. It's that to get a little certificate saying that you can drive a boat
for a kayak too.
I think that it's for.
Well, isn't there
not?
Isn't there? Rookie mistake. Yeah. Isn't there a boating license for larger boats in America?
Nope.
Really?
Yep. You don't need that up to that below a certain tonnage. I think
below commercial or
below
or a medium-sized yacht, something that.
Oh no, you don't need a license for a.
Wow, that's surprising.
Nope. Yeah, that's it. It's just you can just go out and buy a boat and putz around in it, which is part of why you see a lot of recreational boating accidents, because people do stupid stuff, which to some degree they'll anchor off the stern of their outboard boat while they're fishing, and then all of a sudden they get there were 3 NFL players who died doing offshore fishing back 6 or 7 years ago, because it was just they made a stupid mistake. They just made a mistake because they didn't necessarily know better. Oh no, they were trying to sort of pull the engine up, pull the anchor up from so off of the stern. That's what it was. But anyway,
oh god,
yeah. So and then it just flipped their boat upside down, and then they weren't able to ride it, and no one got out to them in time.
Oh no!
So yeah, which this might be closer to 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, I mean, well, boating's more complicated, you'd think, but there's less of an economic barrier of entry to a car, and geographical barrier of entry, because a lot more people have access to cars than boats, and I think with
in the United States,
in the United States,
which is
exactly,
kind of back to the so to some degree it is getting a driver's license or getting some sort of a government certificate to be able to to legally, which again is a whole other thing that these are, but to societally be capable of operating whatever vehicle that you're supposed to is that's both a reflection of of our regional that culture and a society, but I also relate it to like one of my grandfathers. He got his license. He this was back in the early 1920s or so, or I don't know, 30s, and it was his 16th birthday, and that it was just sitting there on the table when he came down in the morning, and that his father had gone to the city hall the day before and just picked up his driver's license for him.
Really?
So I filled out the paperwork, and that it was just sitting there on the table.
And there was no requirements for it?
No requirements, no
besides
tests, no practice. He was just like, hey, here's your license. That, like, of course, he had to learn to sort of drive. But so if you compare, that's also, I would say, an example of like culture changing through time. That's someone who, how our own values have changed both towards a lot more bureaucracy and formal requirements, but also a recognition that just giving everyone the ability to suddenly drive as fast as you want anywhere in the world, like there are serious like safety ramifications to that. So so there's we can talk about ways in which maybe we haven't found that perfect level there, but it's also like okay, we've over time we've said that we shouldn't have 16-year-olds driving around in a car with no supervision immediately,
right? So I mean, we have there's no federal driver's license in the United States. In a lot of countries in Europe, there's federal licenses. And I don't know what it's like in Canada. I don't know if those are provincial or federal licenses in Canada.
I think that they're provincial.
Okay.
But
it wouldn't surprise me if they were. But, I kind of think that the car and before that, the railroad was really this mass transportation that made transportation a lot quicker and cheaper and more available, and the movement of goods more efficient. I think that a culture requires that to have the type of extreme bureaucracy that the United States has and that Western Europe has. Like, you couldn't have verification of driver's licenses for boating license in their case for the boat peoples because there's no infrastructure for them to communicate over a wide range. I mean, I assume a lot of them have cell phones now, which they could maybe do this, but there also has to be the political infrastructure for something like that.
Yeah,
and
but at the same time, I'd say that doesn't mean that they don't have their own regulatory systems, and that those would ostensibly and that
more unofficial. Probably.
Right. Yeah. Much more decentralized. It's like, okay, if you have a teenager who's going to learn how to operate this vehicle, then you are responsible for teaching them how to do it.
Or you just go Saudi Arabia's route and be like, okay, women are not responsible enough to drive vehicles, so we don't let women. Men can do it, no problem.
Right, yeah.
Women, no. This is how we control traffic fatalities. But you laugh, but culturally, that is their way of that's for them. In a lot of, and I don't want to put words in Saudis' mouths, but when you have laws that limit, and I think they've eased up a little bit, but it's not completely open, where women can drive cars. If you haven't, that's a very official legal way that you're showing your values. So I feel comfortable judging at least the society as a whole for that, knowing that the law is there.
I totally agree.
But it's it's a thing. Like it's their perception based on that law that women are less capable in some way, or that might not even. I can't assume their motivation, but it matches other things in their culture.
But regardless, they culturally do not accept, in a general sense, that it's like it's not culturally acceptable for women to drive.
Right.
That like and that's reflected in their laws and in the way that they
right. And that's connected to other things. Women are.
That's just one small example.
A lot of cultural and cultural practices that have been codified in legal practices for what women are and aren't allowed to do. But yeah, so what was the thing that you wrote down? Because we talked about the driver's license, but what was the other thing that we had talked briefly about?
Yeah,
So
we
could
had
probably spend the next 45 minutes just talking about that.
Yeah. Specifically, I had so in response to, not in response, but thinking about your second episode and the about cultural unity and that different identities, and especially in regards to American culture, I thought I thought that your discussion about the American school system and on promoting the idea of how they're reportedly pushing the idea of accommodation over assimilation. It's an interesting concept, and you had talked about the relationship of that, like kind of the other side of that are these that you can easily point to, like ultra kind of American nationalistic things. Not that the Pledge of Allegiance is ultra nationalistic, but it has that kind of that flavor in it, right?
Right. I mean, I'd like to discuss the Pledge of Allegiance first of all.
Yeah, sure.
There's a lot of things to go into here, but like saying the pledge is like it's a ritual by definition. It's a ritual, and in a lot of American schools, they still in the beginning of the day, everyone stands up, you look towards the flag, and you recite a Pledge of Allegiance. It's pledging allegiance to the country. And when I think about other cultural practices from other cultures that do this, what first comes to mind is like Islam praying 5 times a day. And a lot of Muslims pray 5 times a day towards Mecca. And I think that there's a lot of purposes to that, but one of the purposes is to get people to be thinking about the country, or well, in this case, about religion, and saying specific words. Mantras are a thing for a reason. When you say words over and over again, either in unison or over a period of your life, they're in your mind. When you're concentrating on a certain thing, that they're in your mind, and that affects your thinking, whether you like it or not. I mean, so reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, you're saying those words every single day. You're reminding yourself every single day that you're there of this. And it's a cultural thing where it's shared with everyone around you. And there's something very odd about that when it comes to devotion to the country, and it is a very authoritarian thing to do. And I would describe myself as a patriot. I love my country. I love America, and I love Americans. But that's not something I don't know if that's the best way to do it.
It's also interesting that that's a practice that's forced on children at a point where even some of the how many 8-year-olds can say indivisible.
Right. You don't know what it means. But then
exactly that, like,
figure it out eventually, but
and then through context and everything. But like kids always like, oh, invisible to all, like that kids don't really know the the meaning behind
Right.
so what you're saying, and it's interesting that that schools are forcing children to do it, but then from the perspective that like adults don't need to do a Pledge of Allegiance, so that like I don't show up to work and sorry,
they've already been indoctrinated, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Supposedly, I'm sure that but like that's an interesting. Everyone, oh yeah, I did a Pledge of Allegiance, but like no one does it in their adult life
Unless you're a teacher.
unless you're a teacher. Well, all right.
What I'm saying is like when I went into teaching, and I was teaching when I was in teaching college, like I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that we did this. Mm-hmm. This is fucking weird. And I do it because of social pressure. Essentially, I'm not going to be the teacher not doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and I don't think I would abstain even if I felt like I had a choice. Mm-hmm. Like if I felt like there would be no consequences if I abstained, like I'm still going to do it because I still, but I'm not going to judge anybody who doesn't. It's more than just the Pledge of Allegiance. There's more things than that because, like I saw a video of a toddler, 2 or 3 years old, walking around and like thinking that everything was a hand sanitizer dispenser.
Oh, yeah.
And so like really like these things can start at very, very early ages. And that's I brought up that example because that's completely well, I guess it could be construed as a little political, but it's like she's going up for hand sanitizer. Like it's not a political slogan that she's being taught or a way of thinking, but it is a pattern of behavior that she's picked up that she clearly doesn't know the meaning of because she's trying to get hand sanitizer out of a tree.
Right.
Dumb little bitch doesn't fucking know what hand sanitizer does.
But that's
right.
That's also very it's entirely suited to that cultural moment that she grew up in.
Right.
That,
but she has no idea what it means is my point.
Right.
She has no idea what it means
yes.
because she's trying to get it out of a tree. You can't get hand sanitizer out of a tree. You might get some sap.
Yeah.
All right. And that's not going to clean your hands. Make them all sticky. But like there's other slogans too. And these other things, like people a lot of the times tend to view the Pledge of Allegiance positively, but there's like, ones that could, other symbols, not even spoken ones, but like, American flags would be a symbol of American pride that people would wave. But there's 2, 3-year-olds waving, being given by their parents rainbow flags, and they don't have any concept of what that means. And I'm not saying this is a negative thing. I'm saying that there's a lot of situations where children are being taught something that they don't truly understand, and it is indoctrination. And you can view that however you like. And some people would view, if somebody is viewing indoctrination positively, they'll probably try to justify it as something that isn't indoctrination, even when it is. So like kids being taught slogans from a young age, like diversity is our strength, like things like that. I'm just spitting off like liberal talking points. Mm-hmm. Like that's indoctrination in the same way. Like kids don't know what that means. They learn evolving concepts of what those things mean over time in school, and those are shaped by school curriculum that is designed by the state.
And also they're socializing in school and around other kids and
right.
So I remember back in 2016 being surprised when I was working in Canada and that there were Canadian, so it was a summer camp, and that there were Canadian kids there who were talking about American politics, and they were like 10 years old that talking about, they were that, like, one of them, I also remember talking about how he thought that Sean Spicer would be the president if Trump and Pence died, and that like
what?
So like,
wasn't Sean Spicer like a Nazi?
No. He was the.
Oh, was he the press secretary?
Yeah.
Why did I think he was a Nazi?
I don't know.
What the hell am I thinking of?
But like he and that So it was in that, like, I remember I stepped over, like, he wouldn't be the president. Like it would be but it was still that, they would, there'd be a group
Who would
of
have been the
kids
president?
sitting
Nancy
around.
Pelosi?
I don't.
Wait, no, it's the Senate pro tempore.
Is that it?
I don't remember who that was.
Yeah, exactly. I don't remember who it was then either. But like, basically, it was. I remember it being really surprising because it was like, oh, that like the of course these kids, they aren't talking about. They've picked up the political discourse from their parents and from the oversaturation of political discourse in so in the media and the outrage and that everything there, and then they're taking that and parroting it without the political context or in which, to some degree, look, kids have always done that, but it's also, we shouldn't pretend like we're over it.
Right.
So in a way, I remember shortly afterwards, I mentioned that to some family friends, and they had a couple of young kids, and so I mentioned that episode, and that the husband and the couple thought about it for a second and turned to the kids sitting there, and he was like, "What do you guys think about President Trump?" And they went, "Oh, President Trump's terrible. I hate him." And they go, and he was like, "Why do you think that?" And that, like, I took time to legitimately listen to what they to what they had to say, and they were, "Oh, he's gross, and he's like, and like they couldn't really come up with like a specific
prejudice is taught, not born children. Orange lives matter.
Orange lives matter, yes. But that, like, that they didn't have the reasoning was built on the social context that they were being raised in,
right? Which,
again, that's
there's plenty of legitimate reasons not to like Trump, but they don't know them.
Exactly. Right. Right. So it was anyway. That was and
I think, honestly, like, the reasons for not liking somebody can be whatever they are, but sure. I think that what usually will end up happening in a lot of cases, and these can change over time, but somebody will have their views, and they'll be growing up with them, and they'll decide their views, and then they'll figure out the reasons later, because there's good arguments for both sides, and depending on how you perceive those good arguments, that's really how you think. And I've met a lot of...
especially the philosophical background of both liberalism and conservatism have legitimate, fundamental foundations.
Yeah.
But then people both get stuck into one side or another, and then build their reasoning afterwards, or they, come to, oh, I think this one thing, and so then I kind of have to meet all the other boxes.
Well, a lot of it can be social pressure, right?
And that too, yeah, totally.
Yeah, like if other people, what I saw a lot in college was that a lot of people would be very adamant that, like, this side is the side that's for human rights. Like, if you don't support this, then you're against human rights. You're a bad person. You're a misogynist. You're racist. You're all these different things. And there's a lot of social pressure in that for people to conform. And, if you can just be like, yeah, that argument makes sense, and it makes sense within your social circle, and it makes sense within your upbringing, then that's what you're going to go with. But human beings, we've been functionally like the same for like 10,000 years, evolutionarily at least. But so it was modern humans in an evolutionary sense that were in the Roman Empire, and they had completely different ideas of morality than we do.
Yeah.
Completely different views of politics. Like, so a lot of people, they tie their political beliefs to their identity. And, everybody does that. I do that still, even though I'm very acutely aware of how this works. But that's why I often don't get offended at people's political beliefs, because often it's just... I think that if you understand diversity, and you understand that there are differences in people, then you should also be understanding that other people's differing upbringings than yours will manifest in them having different experiences, different ways of interacting with the world, and thus different opinions about what is good politically and what is not. And that doesn't mean that they're bad people.
And then especially which is to separate from the, you know, people who are specifically trying to stoke up the elements of the outrage and find something to, you know, to give themselves a platform on. That's, to some degree, I would say that that there's, I mean, there are so many, you know, examples of you know, so you get someone who's classically Republican sitting next to someone who's a big, you know, whatever, leftist pride, you know, person, and they end up having a legitimate conversation, and they're able to recognize each other as you know, that as respectful, you know, people with different, you know, with perhaps a different background, but a different, you know, basic.
I don't know if that's going to happen in all cases.
No,
you know,
and definitely not in all cases. But sorry, I guess what I meant to say is that our current kind of social and political discourse doesn't really accept that that's even possible. It isn't possible in every case,
right? No, but it is very possible.
But it's definitely possible,
but it doesn't. There's a lot to say here. It doesn't. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen if people have no chance of interacting, and people will have less of a chance of interacting if people, based on some specific reason, don't want to be in a specific geographical area or even a specific locale in a geographic area. And I'm talking about like the places where somebody might hang out, like a lot of Democrats from the North or the West Coast. They're not going to want to go to Texas, Nashville, North Carolina. Like, they don't want to go to these places just because, like, I've heard people say it. I don't know how common it is, but I've heard plenty of people say it. Like, I don't want to go to Texas because of the politics. And some people will even say bad things about the people down there. Yeah, and, you know, great fucking people. I love them. I love all the people across our country. But
and they'd say the same thing about, I don't want to go to California or New York, or, you know.
Some people would say that.
Yeah.
And they're robbing themselves about the experience because, you know, every state in this country has something to offer. They really do. And they all have great people in them. Some less than others. I'm looking at you, New Jersey. Okay. But what the fuck was I saying?
I mean, so this kind of goes into something that I wanted to, that we briefly touched on before we started talking, which was specifically then, again, going back to your topic in the second episode, like, how do we separate our American culture from both political identity in terms of like a partisan political identity, but also the political, like the American state, that like what can we, how does it kind of, in your opinion, what do you think brings us together apart from we all live underneath the, you know, the bald eagle? And
it's really hard to say. I mean,
which it's a very difficult question, but it's,
you know, the political entity of the United States. There was interaction and there was cooperation between groups of states at different points, and there was also like antagonism between different states. And when I say states, I mean colonies that would become states. So there was the New England Coalition that fought together, and there was a few others. But the start of the United States was kind of it was mostly the power of the elites. These are mostly aristocratic English, Anglo-Saxon, or really Norman gentlemen that were leading this, but they decided to work together, and with working together and putting all these mostly English colonies together, they binded these identities. And there's a really good book called, it's called something Nations, American Nations by Colin Woodard. It's one of my favorite American history books. I recommend it to everybody. But that book describes different nations within the United States, Canada, and Mexico that are a reflection of the past immigration into the United States and migration of peoples. Because some of these migrations are not, some of them are forced. And I'm not sure if immigration implies choice, but the movement of peoples within the United States that create these different nations. And these have identities and they cross borders, in a lot of ways, like in Colin Woodard's book, Cascadia, which is like the Pacific Northwest, it includes, most of British Columbia, whereas the Yankeedom, the part that includes, it's New England, New York, parts of the Midwest, and it includes the Canadian Maritime provinces. And those places have their distinctions. In a lot of ways, us as New Englanders, I think we have a lot in common with the people from the Canadian Maritime provinces.
Oh, big time! Yeah,
and a lot of cultural similarities.
They're a Red Sox fans up there.
Are they really?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, fuck Toronto, right?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, and to be honest, a lot of the migration up to those maritime provinces was by loyalist forces, loyalist families who left the United States after the American Revolution was over. They went back to British territory. Either forced to or they wanted to. What's up?
Sorry, no, I'm just picking up a...
There was a car driving by.
Oh, was it? Okay.
And I have the window open. I probably should have closed it. But,
yeah, everyone likes background noise in their podcasts.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I forgot.
So the American identities. So the identity of us as Americans is kind of like it's created and it exists only if we think it exists, and how important we think it is also up to us. And I think people put a lot of importance on different categories in different places. So in the United States, we put importance on our nationality, on being Americans, and these are differences for different people, but there could be religious affiliations, racial affiliations, socioeconomic affiliations. And when different cultures, in different cultures, people put different amounts of importance of largely their identity into these different categories. So in a lot of parts of the world, and this would have been true in Middle Ages Europe, they would have put more importance on their religion. This is prior to the nation state, so there isn't as much of a devotion, and that's why kings were sometimes forced to do things by the Pope. Like there was one king, an English or a French king, that stood outside the gates of the Pope's house or the Vatican for 3 days, begging. You know about that? Okay, well that happens. Because the church's power was over it. And a lot of times we look at from the West, we look at it from the perspective of nation states. And it doesn't work in places like Afghanistan, where their religion and their tribal affiliation in a lot of parts of it is much more important. But we just assume that the nation state, that like a large country is what people want, but it doesn't fit into everybody's culture. And it has to do with the technology and the environment that we have. And what I think has happened the last few decades is that the culture has shifted and the way that people think about things has shifted. And there's been more of an importance put on things like race. And, and that might sound counterintuitive because somebody's race prior to desegregation and then, many years after that as things gotten better, not that everything's all hunky-dory along race relations, but race matters should, in theory, matter less than it did in the past. But there is a resurgence of racial politics. And I wish I had some statistics ready on that, but I don't have it. It's there. But
do you? I mean, so from a historical perspective, there's definitely stuff that keeps us at least unified and working together as a nation. But do we kind of, going forward, how do you promote that in a way, specifically in the like American context? That like the way that I was thinking about it driving here is like, are we attempting to like push the idea of like American culture, or like, are we trying to pull people towards us? That the way that I, which maybe this isn't, but like I specifically think of, and this was more in terms of going back to how to the like the schoolroom like Pledge of Allegiance kind of style of teaching American culture, that's in a way that's that's entirely, it's something required by the school administration. Whereas I think of like my grandmother, she was born in Manhattan. She lived so in the U.S. so her whole life, but she didn't learn English until she was a child. She was like 8 or 9, because they totally spoke Ukrainian in the household. Her parents were very set on going back to Ukraine. She, other than that, she spoke like Polish and Russian a little bit in the neighborhood, but like it was entire. But so that like up until she passed, she still had a little bit of an accent, even though she was just born in New York. Yeah. But so her family had a very heavy kind of.
Well, where did she go to school?
I think so. That's when she started to sort of learn English.
Exactly, right.
So it was when she went to school, and then she was like, oh, I don't, I have to learn how to speak what all the other kids are here speaking.
Yeah.
And that even though her parents were heavily pushing the Ukrainian culture, she would talk about how like when she was a growing up, she just wanted to be like an American kid. She pushed some of that stuff away.
Yeah.
When she so they used to make her take part in all these Ukrainian traditions, so that like traditional holidays and everything, and that she eventually married an Italian Finnish guy.
Exactly.
And that she didn't teach my dad or uncle Ukrainian. Yeah. That to some degree, I know that she later kind of found her way back into an appreciation of like Ukrainian culture, but for a while she was like, no, I just want to be American. That's all that I wanted to do. We live here. This is our home. This is the only thing I've known. That like, mm-hmm. And that she felt the. So I think that's, which I guess that's also an example of culture being forced down onto children in a way. Although
at that point, a lot of the education was about assimilation. So she started learning English, and this was likely socially and everything pushed on her, and that might have had an effect. Like, who knows? Like, yeah. I don't know what her motivation is, but I don't think that that's great. I don't think it's perfect. I mean, sure. That's that there was a loss of culture there,
right?
But
right.
It's also like that's one extreme, like that.
Right.
That's the extreme end of the other extreme end of that is that people come here, and not that I'm saying that this is happening because I don't, but people come here and then people come here as in here to the United States, and they go to public schools that are American schools. and there isn't any amount of teaching about what being an American is. So if they could be born here and go to an American public school and still only interact with people of their own ethnic, religious group, and not, or even if they're not going to a public school, and not have anything in common with other Americans who are not part of their specific group, I don't think that's good either. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think that a country like ours that isn't formed, like, there's no, like, we don't have a history of, like, Charlemagne that turns into, like, Frankish, which turns into to France, or, like, the Anglo-Saxon history. We don't have, like, an ethnic group that became the American country. Obviously, there's Native Americans, but they're not the basis of the United States of America. It's a settler state, right? So it's like,
even our Anglo-Saxon background is tainted with, or not tainted, tainted in a positive way with all the different other ethnic.
Like, we're not an Anglo-Saxon country. Like, you can argue that the United States is originally an English diaspora country, but, like, a lot of them, in certain parts of America, there's still plenty of people who are descended from those early Americans, and I have a little bit of blood in me, like, of that. Like, a lot of white Americans do, but you and I, we're mostly not. Or maybe, no, you're a fucking aristocrat. I forgot. I've seen your house. Yeah, never mind. You're right. But that's the difference. See, you're from northern New England, which is still a lot of Old English blood, and I'm from southern New England.
I mean, the waspy side of the family, so is from Rhode Island.
Okay,
but that's
great. Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Okay, got it. Okay. So, shit. What was I saying? What was it? What were we talking about? The country. So Americans, like there has to be a medium where people like can have their culture, their pre-American culture of like where they're descended from and where their parents might have came from. But I met people that were born in America. They speak English. They went to public schools in America. And when you ask them, they don't identify as American. They identify as something else. They identify as, Mexican or Persian or whatever else. I'm saying those two because I've had those two specific examples given. And it's like, if people are doing that, then what's the fucking point? Like, we're not going to have a country in a few decades if that happens. Because at the same time, there's other, it's not just that, it's not just immigrants who are coming and they have those other identities. There's regional identities. Like, I don't think, like, this doesn't exist right now, but, like, there could be a resurgence of the idea of a New England identity that supersedes the American identity if the American identity isn't pushed. So, I don't know how. Because those public schools are fucked. And I think that's probably the root of it is the public schools have to be the one to do it. And since I don't fucking believe in public schools, I don't know what I can recommend that those institutionalized child abusers and many child molesters, one of the largest groups of people that are going to abuse your kids, most likely to do it, is going to be public school employees. So, like, in a lot of cases that is true. Since I don't believe in that, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's naturally what the path of going into the future is, whether that's possible with the technology that we have in the increasingly globalist world, and increasingly, like, even over the past 30 years, an extreme extension of global capitalism, where it's all intertwined between different places, where you can get pairs that were, grown in... I found this example in the UK that pairs were like, it was like a little plastic cup of pears, and they were grown in like Argentina, and they were packaged in Bangladesh, and they were being sold in a whatever that British grocery store is, Tesco or something. Yeah. I
was going to say, I feel like part of the, I mean, I don't have easy answers either. But I think that, and this is probably even harder, I think that one of the things that we can do to help push the idea of an American identity an American culture is kind of following up on the mythology of on the American mythology in terms of that, like both our the democratic values that the country was supposedly it was supposed to be based around, and was in in a number of ways. But that's a whole other kind of conversation.
Yeah.
That like I feel like so many people end up coming out of school systems, and then they or they're being told in class, oh yeah, so we do the pledge of allegiance, and then in civics class we learn what's in the Bill of Rights, and then they learn online, oh wow, here's a bunch of examples of like terrible stuff that the FBI also was doing back back in the 60s, and it's
or
like,
even they teach it in school,
which
they probably should,
right, but then if we don't have can't follow up after that and be like, hey, these are ways that we're either and that's both in terms of policy and in ways that the government's acting, but also in ways of just people as Americans being good to other people who are American, that like that's a people actually caring. That's something that like that like I don't know if you about like I don't know if you want to include this, but like what you were doing down in Florida that like the last week in relation to the hurricane, that's a great example of a group of American people.
I was hoping you'd bring up the fact that I spent a week volunteering in Florida with disaster relief. I just wanted to stroke my own ego, and I couldn't bring it up myself, so I appreciate that. Yeah, I am magnanimous.
He is incredibly humble.
I'm the most humble person in the entire world.
Sam actually just stood up and made a bow.
I don't know why you're not saluting me right now.
But like that's I think that's the kind of thing that's a great example of people of people continuing to care about and serve other people as Americans. Like, anyway, that's a really cool thing.
Yeah, you said something before, and then I had forgotten because I was basking in all that flattery.
Mm-hmm.
But you said something before.
You are glowing.
What did you say? I'm always glowing. What did you say? What did you start talking about at first when you were saying that? Do you remember?
Oh, following up on the
American
mythology.
So honestly, like, a lot of this stuff might be different because of the technology that we have, because of the social media that we have. But I feel like following up on the American dream and having the American dream be true, which it was for a long time for a lot of people, it never really worked out for black people. But, or maybe it did at certain times and it was kind of like taken away. There's definitely some situations like that, which I'll go into it at different places. But, over time, the definition of like, it used to be just English, Scottish, French, and German people were kind of like it that could come to America and be prosperous, and that was expanded over time. And there's something to that. We might not think that that's a big deal because today we think about all these people, including the Irish, the Italians, the Armenians, Greeks, as white, but it's only not a big deal because we view them as white today, and we view them as white today because of changing cultural practices in the United States. And I don't think it can be understated the level of cultural change that took and how significant that is. And, me as primarily, I am of Irish blood. And, without that cultural change, I would be a second-class citizen based on what at the time would have been considered race. And that's not true anymore. I wasn't discriminated against in any way growing up, besides, some Protestants being a dick because I'm a filthy papist, and that, did happen a couple times, but, there wasn't any oppression of that. There wasn't anybody burning down the Catholic Church like the KKK did in the 1920s. But you know what? I forgot what prompted you to say that again?
Again, following through on the promises.
A lot of the shady stuff the FBI does, the terrible central bankers. People will forgive all of that shit if they have economic prosperity, and economic prosperity in the sense of relativity of economic prosperity. If the American dream, which can be quantified in having a better material life than your parents. That is the way I'm going to quantify it. It's not the only way to quantify it, but that's what I mean in the most simple terms. If that were to have continued, and that has no longer continued for the majority of Americans, on average, people's lives are getting worse, not better. But if that might have continued, and if that were to continue, everything else could be taken care of pretty easily. Like all the other political issues that the people have, they'll let them go as long as things are getting better and they feel like they're getting a slice of the American dream. But if they're not, I don't know.
That's almost that. There's a interesting little thing. Lenin, as in Vladimir.
Yes, that's the only Lenin I know.
Oh, as opposed to Beetle. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, John Lennon?
Yeah.
I don't give a shit about John Lennon.
Anyway. John Lennon, universally better than Vladimir. But
I mean, yeah. I don't give a shit about him, but he's definitely better.
Yes. But
Yoko Ono was pretty bad, but she wasn't that bad.
He had... So I remember reading an interesting paper he wrote sometime between like 1905 and that like 1914, where he was talking about how a revolution based around that like material that like material, I can't think of the term, that like what would be the opposite of like excess, material lacking, that like that it couldn't be relied upon to create a successful communist revolution, and
yeah, I bet not.
But that's exactly what ended up happening in 1917. That the revolution in St. Petersburg, it was sparked because a bunch of that women, that like mothers,
but they didn't have enough bread, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's different than material lacking.
Oh,
right?
That's what he was specifically talking about.
Was he saying that even not having enough food, it couldn't be relied on? Wow, that guy didn't know what the fuck he was talking about.
And that, well, I mean, but that like I mean, tons of people will talk about the failings of the Bolshevik.
He said the revolution couldn't be relied on. And it couldn't, because then it produced Stalin, which is what he didn't want.
Exactly. That like it wasn't, communists.
Lenin was pretty bad, but he wasn't as bad as Stalin.
That's true. Communists, would be happy to go, the 1917 revolution wasn't a true communist revolution, and Russia isn't a great example of, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, but the idealistic philosophical boundaries that you've created for your utopian revolution aren't realistic, because people in the real world have real world needs,
right?
And that and that it's those real world needs that ended up producing the largest communist revolution that they
generally produce all revolutions.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the root of it, where like ideology doesn't often bother me. Like if there's some weirdo in Kentucky who's even if he's in the woods of Maine who's spouting off some racist bullshit, it doesn't become an issue until there's a bunch of them and they don't have enough food.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that's why that stuff doesn't bother me, because it's a one-off, and you can always expect it in society. I'm going to do an episode on that specifically. Mm-hmm. I'm going to write that down when I'm re-listening to this. But
there was so when I think about like communist groups, I always think of outside of the library at school, our largest library. A few times I remember seeing it was like a stupid little stand, painted red, of course, little wooden stand with two guys out there in their like 50s who are like overweight and like that sitting there with a bunch of communist iconography across it, and join the Communist Party of Toronto, and that like and that I was like, yeah, you guys are fucking lame. That like
Yeah.
that like you're that like I'm not afraid of you. That like
Yeah.
are you saying that you're gonna create? You know, you're either you're just ridiculous.
Right.
And
It's not the college track star who's coming out and starting the Communist Party,
or even
or even a manager of a fast food restaurant.
right. Yeah. It's a couple people with
It's not. It's
yeah.
Right. All right. Well, with trashing communism at the end of the episode. But I've trashed fascism and communism already in this podcast. It only took a couple episodes. It's not hard to do.
It's really not hard.
Yeah, it's not hard to trash communism. It's not hard to trash fascism.
Hell no.
All right. I think we can end there. Good talk.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for being here.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure why you made me wear this skirt. So if I wasn't going to be any camera.
Yeah, that's only for my personal sexual satisfaction.
Oh,
actually,
is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was just for me.
Gotcha.
All right. That's it.
Thanks for having me on.
Episode 6.